takes his heat at times, but he's fearless. And when you realize how difficult it is to always be able to find a hot button opinion, and then he's got great other attributes as a storyteller and feature writer.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the 21st episode of the Underrated Podcast, the podcast where we talk to you about sports and rant about a bunch of stuff that we think should be ranted about. Today, we have a special guest. He was a sports reporter at the Globe and Mail for 16 years. He is now a radio and television personality for Sportsnet, and he is a regular contributor to Sportsnet magazine, and is a regular co-host of Primetime Sports with Bob McCowan on the Fan 590. Michael Grange, how are you?
I'm good. Thanks for having me on, guys.
Thank you so much for coming on.
Only thing I got to clear up in that intro is very sadly, Sportsnet magazine does not exist. So I contribute to sportsnet.ca only, but it was a great run while it lasted.
And you were also at, like, as we mentioned, the Globe and Mail for 16 years. Given how good of a writer you are, you likely had opportunities to go to larger publications like The Star or The Sun or even Hockey News. What made you stay at Globe and Mail for so long?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily say any of those were bigger publications. I mean, the Globe and Mail was a newspaper record nationally for over 100 years. And certainly when I was there, they had a significant commitment to sports and covering sports. And so, so it was an honor to work there. I never even thought of going to another publication. I thought it was a great place. I got to do great stuff. And, the Sportsnet was a little bit different animal. So it was a great opportunity when it presented itself. But my years at Globe were fantastic.
That's great. So journalists and columnists have often been criticized for writing their opinions, especially when it comes to local sports teams. How did writing Leafs Abomination come about?
Well, I would say this. I mean, people may not always like your opinions, but your job is, especially particularly as a columnist, is to offer opinions, and the goal, at least from my point of view, would be to offer opinions or insight that was at least a little bit fact based. And if people didn't like it, they didn't like it. But as it relates to Leafs Abomination, which I wrote with Dave Feschuk, who's still with the Toronto Star. There's also a personality on TSN. That came out in, I think, 2011. And might have been 2008. I don't know. It's a long time ago. But really, that was just, the Leafs were, they just seemed to be absolutely directionless at the time. And it was kind of in the period before they hired Brian Burke, and the math was just adding up. I mean they'd been sort of chasing their tail for, at that time, at least 40 years, and it just seemed the right time to write a book that kind of tried to explain why and put it in a bit of context, that this just wasn't bad luck, and what elements of their ownership and their management approaches over the years had really kind of let them down. And that was really it. And it was a really fun project to do. And, it got a fair bit of traction at the time. It was a bestseller. And what was interesting was the book kind of concluded on a bit of a hopeful note that Brian Burke, who's hired sort of just the year that book came out, would be, the person to lead the club out of the wilderness. And to an extent he did. There were some successes, but, I would argue that a lot of the choices he made kind of made the problems even worse in the end.
And did you think that there might have been any risk involved with saying how big of the opinions Leaf fans or how crazy the Leaf fans are?
No, none. No. The only time I ever worry about an opinion or a story is sometimes you're really affecting people's personal well-being in a way, and they are people. The people, when you're writing about athletes and executives and sports figures, they're the public figures, and then part of when you jump into that arena is you are expected to be criticized and held accounted for, and by the public and by the media by extension, and that's sort of the game. But there doesn't mean they don't have feelings, and they're not people who have families, and so sometimes you touch on stories or issues that are pretty close to them as individuals, and I have a heart. Like I don't relish in that, or kind of criticizing people just for the sake of it. But when it comes to an organization like the Leafs and people, no, like really, if anything, your interests are aligned with Leaf fans. Like why is this team losing? Why did it lose so consistently for so long? Why can't they employ the resources they have to win consistently? I mean, those were really the questions I was after, and we were after. And which Leaf fan wouldn't want those answered? I can't think of one.
When you were growing up, there was no ability to kind of write online. What tools would you suggest an aspiring journalist would use to establish themselves as a journalist?
Today?
Yeah, like
now, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. Today. Yeah.
Well, I think definitely the environment's changed, and you're right. When I was, say, in my growing up in the 80s, for example, or going to school as for journalism in the 90s, the way for information to be presented was pretty strictly controlled. Like it was pretty much, in a mainstream media outlet. And if you worked for one of those, you had the opportunity to kind of participate in the industry. And if you didn't, all you could do was try and break your way in. And, the upside was that the industry was a little more stable then. And if you could kind of cross that barrier, the career was a lot more predictable than I think it is now. However, now, if you want to break in, all you got to do is, set up a website, start a podcast, become an online commentator. Like people have kind of emerged just being really smart about how they manage how they present themselves on social media. And if you're really talented and really committed, you can get noticed because that stuff always stands out. And, where it all leads to is maybe a little uncertain than it was 25, 30 years ago. But I would say if you're trying to have a voice in sports media today, my advice is get a voice and just start doing it and be committed to it and be prepared to do it for a long time with minimal attention and minimal return on the investment. But if you're really meant to be that kind of person, there's enough examples of people who've broken through doing just that. So you can supplement that, I think, maybe with the right type of school opportunities, be it a journalism program or whatever it might be. But if I was in a position where I was looking to hire or add somebody to to a mainstream media outlet, if you don't have a track record of kind of do it yourself type journalism, then then you're going to look for the next guy who does.
And you've also co-written 4 editions of a book called Basketball's Greatest Stars, and we know you're known for being a very high basketball analyst. And if you had to write a book of Toronto sports media's greatest stars, who are some of the names that we'd see in that book?
I don't know. It's a great question. Right now I'd say the person who probably has the highest profile and is maybe the most versatile is probably a guy named Bruce Arthur at the Toronto Star. who, is really, can has shown himself to be able to be really expert and insightful and on almost any major sports issue out there, basketball included. Dave Feschuk, he's at the Star. Dave Feschuk, the Star, he's kind of best known maybe for his Leafs coverage. But, again, as a guy, really, really versatile guy, and probably, one of the guys in the industry who's the most, known for, he can really kind of spot an issue and is not afraid to go after an issue and really be kind of hard hitting on those issues. And he does it smartly, he does it generally pretty fairly, and I think he serves readers really well. I think he's a great example. Steve Simmons at the Sun, he still gets it done. He's been doing it forever and ever. But one of the, he certainly takes his heat at times. But he's fearless. And when you realize how difficult it is to always be able to find a hot button opinion, and then he's got great other attributes as a storyteller and feature writer. He would be there, I think. And then you got a whole bunch of, you go on and on. There's a lot of younger guys who are really kind of making their mark. Guys like Eric Corrine at The Athletic, Blake Murphy at The Athletic. You're really kind of, I think, ahead of the curve in terms of incorporating traditional print elements with the opportunities provided by, to write online digitally. Doug Smith at Toronto Star, he's covered the Raptors literally since day one. Never misses a day. And and just a good example of what like a really old school approach to beat reporting can provide. The stories he did when he connected with DeMar DeRozan and discussions about mental health are a great example of that. And there's many other guys I'm leaving off. You go print, TV, radio. Just in the online space, guys like. Lou Will and Alex Wong, William Liu and Alex Wong, who kind of are at the Score, have done a great job kind of really kind of bridging that making that connection between social media and really high quality written work and analysis. So, literally, I mean, I could go on and on. I'm just, I don't want to leave people out is more the problem, but I know I am. And at Sportsnet alone, I mean, there's just so many good young talent coming up. And guys like Chris Johnson on hockey, all are.
And what do like Tim and Sid need to do to be in your book?
Baseball coverage, I think, is the best there is.
All right, that's awesome. And now, kind of transitioning into like the analyst stage, in terms of player salaries for both the NHL and the NBA.
There's a long list. They're master educators. Sorry, what about it?
And like, how will teams and players approach free agency? And do you think that the short-term deals will be what teams desire to commit to?
Well, everything's changed, right? Because of the pandemic, the finances of the leagues. It's still to be shown exactly how it's going to be affected, but it's going to be negative and significantly negative. I think to the extent that so the short answer is you don't know what is going to be available for anybody. I would have told you before things changed that, I think for the most part, NBA players have really benefited by going with shorter deals. There's always the risk of injury, obviously, but I think there's kind of enough examples where players have benefited by going with shorter deals and being able to kind of really dictate their future and have, as a result, have some influence on the direction of the teams they're on, so I think that's really worked for them. I think in hockey, because they still have 7 and 8 year contracts, I think players are much more likely to kind of look for those long-term deals because it's such a dangerous sport and there's so much risk of injury. But I think hockey, the sport, suffers because there's so the amount of player movement and off-season drama is so limited as compared to, say, basketball. So different sports, different points of emphasis, but I think the real issue there is I think going forward, I'm not sure what the right move is going to be, because I think if you're a free agent in the next year or two.
I kind of have a follow-up question here to that. Do you think that this affects the owners in general in terms of how much money they're going to make in the future, or do you think the owners are kind of going to get away scot-free with all of this?
Well, the way, well, no. I mean, their revenues are going to be significantly affected, right? Like, and officially, like the NBA and NHL, they're in revenue sharing agreements. So, the owner's share of revenue is tied to what, and there's a formula that dictates how it's split up. And so, I think the NBA, they're talking about a potential $2 billion drop in revenue this year as compared to last year. I'm sure it's going to be significantly affected next year as well. So that is less money in the owner's pockets and less money to be divided among players. The difference is owners and the NHL, the exact same situation. Baseball, slightly different because they don't have a revenue sharing, quite a stricter revenue sharing formula, but
yes. And how do you think the NBA will deal with reopening the doors when rules for doing that vary from state to state with an existing travel bans?
All the sports, the issues are the same. And I think as it affects the Raptors, you have the additional complication of the border. So I think the last news is that they're going to try and open practice facilities by the end of next week. So I think that's just as a kind of a solution to avoid players in states where things are opening up kind of seeking out their own workout facilities that are probably less, I guess hygienic is the word, and less controlled is really the issue than the team facilities are and can be. And so I think that's really a response to that. But I don't think it's any indicator really that the league is any closer to figuring out how to resume a season, for example. And as it relates to that, I wrote about this the other day. If you're right now, I think half the Raptors are kind of Wisconsin, Toronto, and the other half of the Raptors and staff are elsewhere in the U.S. And so whatever direction the team moves, if play resumes in any shape or form, it's going to be complicated because if everyone congregates in Toronto, those that are in the U.S. will have to kind of go through a 14-day quarantine. If everyone who's in Toronto goes to the U.S. to centralize there, those guys will all be under a 14-day quarantine. And, and that condition in theory would apply every time teams and players cross the border. So it's going to be a really interesting time. And I can pretend and speculate on things you've heard or might make sense, but really nobody knows.
All right. Is there any reason to believe that the Leafs have a desire to get rid of Freddie Anderson and move forward with a guy like Jack Campbell?
I don't know. I don't know. Your guess is as good as mine. I mean, I don't report on the Leafs all that closely, or at all really recently. It seems to me that you've got a guy you can depend on more or less in Freddie Anderson. I don't think Jack Campbell's the answer. I guess it's really going to come down to, can you get something comparable in terms of performance from your goaltending position, regardless of name, and can you, as a package between your starter and your backup, because clearly not having a backup kind of screwed them this year. Really, can you do it at a more cost-efficient basis, or the most cost-efficient basis? Because they've got to find economies everywhere in their lineup because they've committed so much to their top 4 or 5 guys. So, I don't think Jack Campbell has shown at any point that he's a potential NHL starter. But I guess the flip side of that is I'm not sure Freddie Anderson is in for a great raise. So, maybe status quo will be the answer.
As a final question, so first of all, thank you so much for coming on. But I watched a video this morning about Tim and Sid specifically, talking about overhyped Leaf fans. signing all these big free agents and still can't win a playoff series since 2004. Do you think that trend will continue with the signings that they make or potentially make this season, like Jake Muzzin's extension or rumored Joe Thornton signing?
Well, I mean, I think the days of the Leafs signing huge deals for guys is probably gone, right? Like they're pretty much locked in because, again, you've got, what is it, about $44 million tied up with Matthews, Marner, Tavares, and Nylander. So, when you're talking about a Joe Thornton signing, I mean, that's not going to be a big dollar signing. I'm sure it's going to be like 1 year for $2-3 million. I mean, these are not, you're really looking for a power play specialist at that point. Extending Jake Muzzin, I mean, he's definitely one of your top 4 defensemen. So if you can get him at a, anything approaching a reasonable deal, that seems like good business. So I think, to Sid's point, I mean, there's been a lot of flashy signings that have, for good reason, I think, got Leaf fans' hopes up. But but now you're kind of, this is the team you got, more or less. And so the question is, what kind of less flashy signings can you make to augment the group you have, and hope that that's enough to contend for a Stanley Cup.
Alrighty, thank you so much for coming on.
Cool. Thanks a lot, guys.